Good morning, everyone. I know this looks kind of odd what I'm using here. This is called our Catchbox microphone, and I want to tell you what we're going to do with that in just a second. But I want to welcome you. My name is Amy Sullivan, and I am the Director of Library Services here at Matheson Library. I'm also the co-chair of the One Book Read Committee, and on behalf of the One Book Read Committee, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today in this important and wonderful discussion we have going on of Crystal Wilkinson's Water Street. This is my, I think, 7th year being on the One Book Read Committee, and my 4th year as chair. And since I've been here, this has actually been one of the most talked about, that I've noticed, books on campus, so in my opinion. And it's promoting wonderful discussion among our classes, among the community, and we're just really excited to be able to talk about this book and some of the stories today. So thank you again for attending. If you didn't get a chance and want to, we are going to give away a copy of Water Street at the end of this event today, and there's a jar at the sign-in table. You can drop your name in there. We, of course, have refreshments and invite you to enjoy some of that, and we want to welcome you today. So this catch box at the end or throughout, and our moderator today is going to tell you about how the discussion is going to go, but throughout we have this microphone for you, and we're hoping that you will use it. We need you to use it, actually, so everyone can hear. If you have a comment or a question, I'm going to toss it to you, or others that have had to toss it. It's just a little like this. It's like a beach ball. It's really not going to hurt it. Just don't throw it at someone, of course, but just toss it lightly, and that way everyone, we won't have to run to you to get the microphone to you, and it hopefully won't be too intimidating. It picks up real well. Our TV crew today will be able to hear you, and our audience that's watching today on Facebook Live will be able to hear you, so please utilize this. And I know some people say, well, I've got a loud voice, you can hear me. Well, they won't be able to pick that up on TV, so we do need you to use this. So thank you for helping us out with that. So it is my pleasure today to introduce our moderator for the panel today, and that's Britton Shurley. He's also the co-chair of the One Book Read Committee, and he's our dean here on campus of Humanities, Fine Arts, Business, and Social Sciences. So we're thrilled to have him as our moderator, and I'm going to let him get going. Thank you very much.
All right. I'm really honored to have a good panel of guests with me today. The first person here is Corbin Snardon, and he is the Education Chair for the Paducah NAACP branch here in Kentucky. We also have Octavia Lawrence, and she is WKCTC Associate Dean of Student Services. We have John Bilak, who is the WKCTC Student Government Association President. And then we have Tor Gar, who is our Student Government Association Secretary. As Amy kind of said, one of the reasons we chose this book this year for our One Book Read, we thought it provided a really nice opportunity for us as a campus and a community to have some in-depth discussions on complex topics such as race, mental health, gender, sexuality. And so today we're having our first panel on that, and we're going to talk about race relations as those appear and for the prominent stories in the collection, and just use those kind of as jumping off points so that we can talk about race relations and issues of diversity and inclusion in contemporary society at large. We want this to be a pretty informal discussion. I have a list of some talking points that'll start us off, and then the panelists can kind of weigh in on their thoughts. But at any point, if you feel like you would like to weigh in the discussion, we will throw the nice little blue box at you and jump in and give us your thoughts. So the story we're going to start talking about today in Water Street is Junior 1979, and I think as a whole that's probably one of the stories that deals most deeply with issues of race and cultural identity. So I think the first question I've got for everybody is really involves the characters in this story deal with a lot of kind of confusion and misunderstanding around issues of race, and in my reading, a lot of that confusion and misunderstanding stems from the lack of interaction that takes place among the white and black communities in this collection. So I would just like you to speak to how you saw that playing out in the story of Junior, and then how you see that still playing out in society at large. Jump in there.
So I guess I'll start. I think the confusion a lot of times in that particular story, I agree with you that it was coming from a lack of interaction. But if we're talking about from a contemporary view of society, we're also looking at a point of lack of exposure too. It is completely possible to live in the same community, the same city with someone, and never know anything about them, and never know what side of the street they grew on, never know what their interests are, their cultural identity, or any of those things. And particularly if you're talking about a rural setting like Water Street, everybody kind of stays to themselves. You know, everybody is in their own little world, they do their own little thing. And so in contemporary society, we do the same thing because we like to separate ourselves, unfortunately.
I also think that it's some of it, just like in Water Street, I think some of it happens to be just the lack of courage to ask questions and to be able to discuss race and actually feel vulnerable and being able to put yourself in a position where you would ask questions, and that limited exposure really adds to the belief that your perception really is reality and that you don't seek to expose yourself to the ideals or the beliefs of other people.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, sorry, I had to make sure. Yeah, I guess just to reiterate, I think it's, and it goes back to show just like the nature of the conversation that's not happening. I mean, if it were an issue like, how's the weather going today? Everyone can talk about that whenever, but for something like diversity and inclusion, we have to have like huge panels, and it's not a pressing issue that you think about every day. Maybe you do, but for most people, for the majority of the people in the story at least, it's not like part of their thought process isn't always back to that, I guess.
And for me, to me, it's more of, is this loud?
Do you have it on?
Hello? Yes. To me, it's more of differences. As I was reading this, one funny part came up, and Junior was like, "Hey, white boy," and the white boy replied, "What, black boy?" And it was like, "Oh, you're different than I am, and we are going to fight about this." So just understanding our differences and knowing that we are all different it showed a different side, because of course you don't expect the white boy to react when you say, "Hey, white boy." It's becoming more of a social acceptance kind of thing. So just realizing that we're all different and we are realizing this together is one thing that popped out to me.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting scenes for me in this story was highlighting the different experiences that these characters had, but then also there was this really touching moment where Junior's like they've moved the McIntosh family out of the flood, and he's like hanging out in the garage, like on their ratty sofa, like looking at all the pictures, and he realizes, you know, just how much that family looks like his family, regardless of skin color. There are these similarities between the lives they're living, and I think he's kind of forced to have to like do that himself because there's a lack of dialogue. Like he doesn't go talk to the McIntosh family. His parents don't talk to him about race, and so he's kind of left in this, you know, literally alone to kind of figure this out for himself, and that leads him down different paths and decisions he makes later on in his life. I think, you know, John, you brought up that these are conversations that we don't frequently have. Though, you know, I've literally had at least 6 conversations this morning about the pending snow. What can we do? What do y'all think we can do as members of a society to encourage those conversations or to enable those conversations to happen more frequently, so that we do, in a sense, become as comfortable talking about issues of diversity and inclusion as we do about snowfall and sleet?
I feel like, oh my gosh, these microphones are getting me. I feel like one thing that people often overlook as far as like dialogue and like talking through situations is that can be like the end, not just the means. oftentimes people say like, oh, it's if we have this conversation, then we can reach this point. But I think in many cases, just having the conversation is the solution in and of itself. Like it's a really powerful experience that a lot of us don't, like you said, don't have, and that you wouldn't understand the weight behind it because it's not viewed as maybe the solution to the inequality and the misunderstanding and that kind of thing.
I think going along with that same topic, you know, conversation can't just be the end of it. It's a great starter, but I think one of the things that we have to do is make sure that we are representing ourselves. You know, you're in the skin that you're in. You were born in the skin that you're in. You can't help that. But since you wear that constantly, it almost makes you an advocate in your own way, if you want to think about it like that way. You know, there is nothing that I did to choose being a black man, although I'm very proud to be one. It makes me who I am, and I have to advocate for that. So how I represent and how I portray myself, and some of the things that I just tell people is like, you know, fight the box. People like to put things in a box. We like to put race in a box, that in your race, your ethnicity, your culture, that this is the way that you are supposed to act. This is the way that you're supposed to be, that if you are a whatever, if you're a white man, black, female, whatever, you're supposed to be this. And people assume that that's exactly the way that you are. People assume that these are your characteristics. This is all you can do. This is all you can be. You know, if we're talking about things like media portrayal and things, if I ask you like, okay, how are whites portrayed in media versus blacks portrayed in media versus someone who's Middle Eastern portrayed in media versus someone who's Asian that's portrayed in media, you'd get a different answer every time. And so I think we have to work on the way that we represent ourselves and work on the way that we portray ourselves, and so that helps break down those barriers. Because everybody's kind of afraid to go in that topic of race. You know, everybody's afraid to talk about it. But once you break the ice with that conversation, then that's where you have to showcase, okay, this is who I am. This is my culture. This is my heritage. This is my race. This is my characteristics about myself.
And adding on to that, I also think that it's important that we understand that just like that various white people have different experiences, the same holds true for people who are Asian or people who are black, in that you have different experiences. You know, I was raised in Maryland, so my experience is a little bit different than someone who's not raised in Maryland, or I was raised in the suburbs versus me being raised, you know, in the inner city. So I think that it's very important for us to understand that there is diversity even within cultures. And so I think it's truly important, because as we look at media and as we look at things, sometimes we have sometimes we are channeled into looking at something from one perspective. And I think it's very important to understand that people have different perspectives, and you have to, just because you know a black person who lives next door to you, it's very important to make sure that you also understand someone who doesn't live next door to you, who's not your neighbor, and who does things differently. So I think it's really important to make sure that you have that exposure to all kinds of people.
And Ms. Octavia mentioned like having individual differences. I really liked that she said that, because some people come up to me and say, oh, hey, Tor, are you really white though? I'm black though. I'm like, yes, I'm black, but you speak white. I'm like, it's English, so I don't know what you mean by that. Just knowing that people grow up in different places and have different experiences doesn't redefine their culture, it just places them more. Culture is a whole diverse thing, but there are other subcultures involved in that. So understanding that we're all growing in differences, that popped out to me as well.
Y'all are just building in my segues for me. This is awesome. You know, as y'all brought up the idea of media and culture, and I think that goes back to this idea that we might that we live in isolated societies, and so if we lack physical exposure to people from other cultures, I think a lot of times we fill that with contemporary pop culture. You know, so our experience of what it means to be black in America is seen on TV and in movies, or to be white in America means this. I think that plays out significantly in the book. When Junior opens up, he talks about, listening to James Brown and being black and proud and growing his afro like everybody else was in 1979, he says. In what way do y'all see the contemporary media landscape kind of creating positive or negative images of culture, whether that's blackness, whether that's whiteness? So just talk a little bit about media and how that affects our views of others.
I think, unfortunately, pop culture now is not dictated by what we think is popular. It's dictated by what is marketed to us. And so if you go back to Junior's story where he talks about growing his afro out like James Brown, the 60s and the 70s musically had a lot of icons. Like, you had James Brown, you had Sam Cooke, you had Harry Belafonte, you had Lena Horne, you had a list of people that carried themselves in a specific way that really represented the culture well. But if we look at media today, if I never had come to America before, if I never knew anything about the United States, the first thing that I'm going to do is probably turn on the TV to figure out, okay, what are Americans like? And if the only thing that I see on TV is this certain portrayal or characterization of a particular race, white, black, Asian, whatever, then that's what I'm going to assume people are like. That's what I'm going to assume those people are. It's kind of disheartening to me that, if you were to watch TV now, name one sitcom or television show that has positive role model characters that aren't messed up characterizations that are of a different race. You can list off a dozen for white culture, and I'm not saying that that's anything bad. If I can go through All in the Family or Golden Girls or whatever, I can go through a list of them. But for blacks, you got the Cosby Show, maybe the Fresh Prince, Family Matters, and then the list kind of stops. So the way that we're portrayed in society, in pop culture, really dictates to everybody else, because, within your own race, you kind of know, what the barriers are, you kind of know what the boundaries are, you know what is kind of expected. But for someone else to assume that this is how you are, I like the comment that you made, you're speaking English, but they're like, oh, but you talk white. I'm like, well, I didn't know you could talk a color. I'll give anybody in here $20 if you can talk red or yellow. But and somebody's going to try to take me up on that. But where did that come from? Where did that idea come from that, oh, you talk white and he talks black and they talk this other kind of way? Where did that idea come from? Who told you that that is the way that black people have to talk, or that is the way that white people have to talk? So, pop culture has a very big influence on that, and we have to be very mindful that pop culture is one representation, not the total representation of an entire culture.
I think that's very true, and I'm going to go a little bit further, but I think even in terms of, because Corbin talked about it, the idea of what blackness is very much something that is, in my mind, it's fluid, but I think in terms of pop culture, it is very much a certain category defines whether you are black or whatever it is. And I think that a lot of times for people who are growing up in the black community in particular, I think it becomes something that can be stifling, because you have where you might say, I'm talking white, or if you're listening to a certain type of music, then that means that you're not being black enough. And then you have that kind of bouncing in between, because on one end you're not black enough, and then you may end up being seen as something else in terms of the white community. So I think it's very important that we be clear that blackness is something that cannot be defined. It is something that doesn't have parameters, and that it is very important that we learn how to be able to exhibit and share who we are as ourselves, and not necessarily be put into a box and say that if you don't do this, then you're not you're not black enough or you're not being able to do certain things. And I think that's very important because even though we may say that we're fine and that doesn't really bother us, internally that does bother you, that there is something that seen as you not being good enough or something where you're not being black enough.
And I guess to hit on it from kind of my perspective and how I see the root of the problem, as far as like pop culture and media affecting people's perceptions of what races should be and how you should perceive other people. It seems like we're so used to social media and TV and that kind of stuff, even though it's kind of newer and kind of more of our like modern culture. I think similar things have been around for a while that kind of give you a perception or an entertaining idea of what other races and what other cultures look like. And it's easy just to latch on to that as the first and only thing that you get to experience, the only part of another culture you get to see. Like I've never been to China. I've only had like Chinese food in restaurants, but I've seen it on TV. And from what I can tell, they have like festivals every week and that kind of thing, because that's the only thing I've seen. So you kind of get a weird perception of the world when you're looking at it through that lens that's not really accurate, but it's often like entertaining, and I think it's entertaining to exaggerate certain things, like certain ideals and that sort of thing. And I feel like that helps perpetuate like the discrimination and the high standards and the odd standards that are set for just about every cultural group. And to me, that seems like a key point or a key moment that like starts the cycle, or well, maybe perpetuates it. But that's how I feel cultural, like pop culture also, like the idea that it transcends just like news coverage and that sort of thing, but it gets ingrained into different parts of our culture, the popular parts, the parts that like you hear about outside of just your culture. I think that's kind of where that stems from, maybe, or part of the like contributing part of that.
Yeah, you did mention pop culture, like as the name says, pop. It's what pops out to people, what people really see instead of really digging into. Unfortunately, the media isn't a very educative source for students and everyone else, but seeing, for example, I went to an Alabamian family dinner, and we were playing cards, and I played the red card, and to me it's called red, it's pronounced red, but to them it's pronounced red. So like understanding that yes, it's funny because I'm saying it red, but that kind of difference that we experience is something that they never heard of. They've never heard of a Nigerian boy saying red. So it's quite different from what they see on TV. I'm supposed to be like, red, man, red, or something. That kind of portrayal that we're supposed to have as black people, different from the South, from white folks in the South. It's a beautiful difference, but it's not the only difference we have, and it's definitely not the final definition of what it means to be white or black.
So for our last question, really dealing with this story, Junior, I think the story also kind of navigates and highlights the different forms that racism and prejudice take, and I think we see in the character of Junior, we see the term microaggressions, these small acts of intolerance or aggression that kind of grate on Junior as he grows up. The example that comes to mind for me in the book is when they're working at the summer library program, and he and all the other black kids get stuck shelving books and moving boxes, and the other kids that don't know the Dewey Decimal System but happen to be white get the front of the office work of working computers and things like that. So we have these kind of more subtle forms of racism that happen in the story. And then we have these more overt acts of racism where racial slurs are used. And all of these ultimately kind of weigh on Junior. When we were talking about this in my English class, this is one of my students brought this up, and I totally didn't realize it when I read the story. They talked about how much these actually weigh on him as he grows up. So by the end of the story, Junior, as a grown man, is much more worn down as a person than he is at the beginning. You know, he's at the beginning, and he's he's black and he's proud, and he has an idea of how he should you know, carry himself through the world. And by the end, he's much more hesitant and confused about how to navigate things. So my long-winded question, I guess, is how do y'all see those kind of more subtle and overt acts of racism playing out in contemporary society today? What is most prevalent? What's most problematic? Have things, for lack of a better word, progressed since then, or are we doing the same thing?
So that's funny, because when I read that about the students, well, it was actually the black boys who ended up having to stock the shelves. And so the thing that I always think about with microaggressions is the kind of way that it, you know, for lack of a better word, kind of messes with your soul is that you have to question whether or not that is the reason why something was done. And you don't really ever get necessarily the answer. You think in your mind that may be why. Is it because I'm black? Is it because I'm a female? And those are kinds of things that you think about constantly. And I haven't graduated to the place where I don't think about it. If I go into the grocery store and someone is, you know, rude to me, those are things that I think about. Is this because of this, or is this because of that? And I think that with Junior, it's the same thing. It's just a constant questioning of, why are these things being done, or why am I being targeted in this way, and not necessarily always targeted, but why am I being questioned? So would you question the same thing if I weren't black or if I weren't female? And so you have to always keep those kinds of questions in your mind.
Yeah, definitely. Microaggressions are very real, and it's something that is very challenging and difficult to deal with, and it's very hard to explain just all the emotions and things that come with it, and all the times that either you wanted to say something back and you couldn't because of the setting that you're in. Prime example, and this goes to show you that it's not just it is an American thing, but how global it is. I had the privilege to go to Korea over the summer, so I'm in Seoul, South Korea, of all places, and I'm just traveling and I'm enjoying it. Me and a friend of mine who enjoy traveling, we're going through, and we're in the subway station, and it's busy. This Seoul is 25 million people. It's a bustling metropolis. We're trying to get to our transfer train. So we're walking through, and we see this gentleman who was with his girlfriend or lady friend or whoever she was, and they were white. Now, this is a country that is 99.9% Korean, and that is a literal statistic. And so this guy, I don't know what his ethnicity or his nationality was. I just know that he was a white man with a white female. We're just going to our train. We're minding our business, not doing anything. He grabs her arm close to her as if to think that we're going to try to attack him or as if we're going to try to steal. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, do I really want to make a scene? Like, do I really want to say something to this guy? And I'm like, you know, no thanks. I don't beat up people in the subway. That's not what I do. That's not me. That's, you know, nobody just walks in the subway and is like, oh, wow, let me just beat you over the head and take your stuff. Like, but that's a microaggression right there. Or the simple things of, you know, oh, you asked me a question, but you didn't ask such and such a question. Or even more subtle ways like, how do you get your hair like that? Or do you guys like chicken? Like, which is so insulting. I'm vegetarian, I can't, so, but No, we laugh, or we can laugh about it, but those forms of microaggressions are real. But to get to the second part of the question where you're talking about, is it more overt or covert now? I think it's a mixture of both. I do think that the current political climate lends itself to more overt racism, to where people feel more emboldened to say or do things that are blatantly racist. But I think that we have been living with covert racism for the longest time, that the little subtle ways that we are portrayed in media, the little subtle ways that people think that we are, the ways that society tells us that this is the way that you're supposed to act. And what happens with those things is that not only do you as a person internalize that view, but then other people start to imitate it and make it a minstrel show of sorts. Prime example, I grew up with great music. I mean, my parents had me listen to all kinds of stuff. So I'm very well-rounded and very well-versed. But, I mean, I am a hip-hop fan. So if you're a Wu-Tang fan, you know, come see me afterwards. But, you know, I listened to hip-hop like that when I grew up. And then I see hip-hop now, and I see artists like, and I'll just call names out, but I see artists like Post Malone, and I'm like, that's not hip-hop. You think that because you have tattoos or because you made a song with a catchy beat that that's hip-hop. And I'm like, no, I grew up with real hip-hop where, you know, this is talking about real situations where Ice Cube is talking about today was a good day and he just wanted to make it home, or Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and The Message. You know, I grew up with hip-hop like that. But here's somebody else that is not even with the hip-hop culture but has made a defining moment on it because he thinks that because I've got tattoos, I dress this certain way, I make a song that's like this, that's the way that it is. And so those little forms of covert racism pop out all the time. And to the point that you end up questioning yourself. You end up questioning, is this the way that I'm supposed to be? Is this the way that I am? I think Malcolm X said it best. Like, you know, Malcolm X said in one of his speeches, who taught you to hate yourself so much so that you would bleach your skin to be like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your lips, the size of your nose, the texture of your hair? Who taught you all of these things? And the reality is that we taught ourselves and we internalized it. Sorry, that was a long answer.
I really appreciate your answer. I didn't quite make this clear. So I was born in Nigeria. It's somewhere in West Africa. It is in West Africa. One thing I've noticed is that people really want to know where I'm from, and sometimes they don't know how to ask the questions because they're so used to like the social media portrayal of how Africa is supposed to be. So one major question I've been asked was, do I wear pants along the streets? Do I like sing songs to kids on the trees? And I'm like, no. But I don't say it's racism because I don't think they know what, they've never been outside of the country. So experiencing those outside sources like coming to this event to listen to me and know my experiences is one way to really understand different cultures. But I do feel like people really want to know about different cultures, but they don't have any way of asking those questions because all they're used to is social media. So there's a big difference to me between racism and stereotypes and offenses. For example, black people like chicken. I consider that to be offensive or stereotypical, not racist. I, on the other side, haven't seen any white person that doesn't like chicken. I haven't seen any black person that doesn't like chicken. So that's where the stereotype comes from. So just knowing those differences, I see how everything is interconnected with each other and asking questions, even though you feel as if, for me, if you ask me a racist question, I will tell you it's racist. If you ask me a stereotypical question, I'll tell you it's stereotypical. I'll tell you it's a stereotypical answer, but I'll still give you the answer either way because I believe understanding each other is the best way to go.
And I think Toy made a really good point with continuing the conversation despite the microaggressions. I think a lot of the time when those kind of scenarios play out, it's easy to get upset and angry and like, oh man, this is just a racist. I don't want to deal with him today. I don't want to be part of this. This shouldn't be how it is, but it is, and I'm just going to put up with it today. I'm going to roll with the punches. But when he said, I'll tell you the answer anyway, initiating that conversation and trying to overcome the misunderstanding that is the root of the problem, or at least a contributing factor to the problem, is a really bold thing that I'd encourage people to do. I think it's probably one of the best, easiest, well, maybe it's not easy, that can be hard a lot of the times, to overcome the, maybe the anger and all the emotions that come with being stereotyped and whatnot. So I think that's a really, really great point that I just want to emphasize, is that working through it to create a dialogue is really important.
So the second story we really chose to focus on today was the 16 Confessions of Lois Carter. And that story oh, yeah, totally.
All right,
Hold on, wait, I gotta get the blue thing.
Are you going to catch it? Okay. Oh, I'm loud. Okay, so a couple things that you just said about asking the questions, and I appreciate what you said, Tor, about that you're going to answer the question either way. And I just wonder if asking the question is the problem, or the way the question's asked, because I think everything should be in context. And I'm wondering your perspective on, it's okay to ask questions even if they're uncomfortable, because you're trying to find the answer based on, but there's a difference in the way people approach you and ask that question. And the other thing is that something Octavia said that I've never really considered before, is that you said, am I black enough? And that kind of really struck me, because it's not something that I've ever really considered, that you, and what you said, whether you're a female or whatever, or black or whatever, race you are, that it's not something that you think about, that it's like you almost have it from two sides, right? Because you have the fact that people may be approaching you in a racist way, but also from your own culture, that you have said that you kind of get it from that side too, that you're not black enough. And that really struck me, that must be a hard thing to maneuver and figure out. So my question, just is, I appreciate what you said. It made me think of that. But how you feel about the difference in the way that you are approached, and are you still approached, and obviously that you've talked about ways that are unacceptable, but just how you feel about when people really respond and trying to learn more about you in a genuine, true way.
I think that it's very important when you're trying to find those things out, that you develop a relationship, because when I know your intention, it's different than when you are asking me a question and you don't really know me, or don't really want to know me, but may want to know something that is just going to kind of please what it is that you're trying to do. So I think whenever I think about race, and when we have these conversations, I really think that it's very important to create relationship, because you cannot really get to the heart of what that is, or what somebody really feels, without having that sense of relationship. And I think that's very important.
I agree that if you really want me to be comfortable with asking me questions, which I love questions, like I want you to ask questions, but that relationship is key, because if I know where it's coming from, it makes me give you an answer that's actually acceptable. That, I won't just give you a generic, like, oh, how do you get your hair like that? I grow it. Like, I don't want to, I don't want to give you that kind of answer if I have a built-up relationship with you, a friendship with you. So there's that part. But I love you mentioning the part, sometimes I think other cultures do have to deal with getting it from both sides, because I think that if we really talk about race, and I'm going to be very specific here, when we talk about racism, when anything has an ism attached to it, it's a system. It's systematically built. And so you do have to, as a black person, you almost do have to live on both sides of the fence, because on one level, you have to deal with, am I black enough? And then the other level is, well, you sound white, or you sound like this, or you sound like that. And so it can be very isolating. And that goes back to what I said earlier about society likes to put people in boxes, and that if you're not in this check box, then you don't fit it at all. And so it's the understanding that there are multiple ways to be black, to be Asian, to be Muslim, whatever, the Middle Eastern, whatever culture, nationality, ethnicity, whatever you want to put on it. But I think that takes a conscious effort to say, okay, let's not think this way anymore. And it does cause you to have to ask questions that come from a place of innocence, not just, oh, I really wonder how they do that. That just seems so like cool. Like, you know, like I said, if you come up to me and ask me, how do you grow your hair? I grow it. Like, that's gonna get the answer. But if you really come with some sincerity and some genuineness about you, then yeah, that's how that conversation starts, and that's how you build a friendship.
Other questions before we move on? Thank you.
Please ask questions.
I like questions. So there's a good transition here, though, because I think the next story, the 16 Confessions of Lois Carter, as Corbin said, it's dealing with our narrator, Lois Carter, and it's dealing with this idea of people that are being put in boxes. It's dealing with an interracial relationship that began in 1969 when they met in high school, and then it follows them throughout her whole life as she offers 16 little vignettes that kind of confess things that have happened to her or that have bothered her throughout her life. I think one of the things that struck me in this, and just in looking at the time of it, is she says she met Roscoe, her then boyfriend, in 1969. The Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia happened in 1967, and that's the case in which the Supreme Court outlaws any state law or makes illegal any state law that prohibits interracial marriage. So 2 years after that happens is when these two kids meet in high school in Kentucky and kind of start their relationship. And then, you know, the grand scheme of things, that's I had to use my calculator, but that's only 51 years ago. You know, that's really not that much time in American society. So the real question I have on that is, what are your thoughts on how that those boxes played out in this story? Because I do think those characters become isolated because of the way in which they're pushing against the racial boxes they're put in. And how do y'all view the acceptance of interracial society or interracial marriages or relationships in contemporary society versus the time period of the story?
I think, especially in Kentucky, it's like it's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that everybody sees, but nobody really kind of wants to talk about. So it's, there's a lot of places I feel like, especially in rural Kentucky, where it's just not socially acceptable still, which is odd to me. I feel like, you know, if two people want to be in a monogamous relationship, hey, get married. That's what you're supposed to do. But it's just this idea and this notion that you can't go outside of your box. You can't be outside of your box. You cannot marry this person because they're white. You can't marry this person because they're black, and whatever other excuse that you want to put in there, which is completely foolish to me. You know, again, I go back to, if you are two people in a committed monogamous relationship and you are doing everything that couples of the same race would be doing, what's the issue? What's the problem? So like, who said that this was something that couldn't go on? And then we have to also outline the fact that, yeah, even though Loving in Virginia was passed in 1967, which 51 years is not a lot of time at all, we have to consider the fact that interracial relationships were going on long before that. In some cases through forcing, through, you know, rape or any other kinds of things like that. But these relationships have been going on for centuries, thousands of years. And so this notion that somehow in America we can't do it, or that it's still a problem, is completely beyond me.
I really, in thinking about Lois in this, I really felt her isolation, because I really felt like she first of all didn't have her parents, and then she really didn't necessarily fit into the world that she came from, and she didn't necessarily fit into the world in which she was living. And so she experienced a lot of isolation, and talking about, like, I was thinking about her and her mother-in-law, and like how her mother-in-law didn't even want her in the kitchen, you know? And so those kinds of, in terms of isolation, and I, you know, I have a very good friend who was involved in a interracial marriage, and it's quite honestly, just in talking to her and sharing some of her experiences, include things like when they go out to eat, that automatically, she's a white woman, so when things get ready to get paid, the bill goes to her. And like, it never goes to her husband ever. And she just talks about just subtle things like that, and sometimes the looks that you get when you go into certain places, and how uncomfortable it is for her in general. And so I think that isolation is just one of those things that if you cannot find your place in society, or your place within your community, it can be very disheartening, and it can, you know, this talks a little bit about, you know, in terms of, isolation creates all kinds of disconnect and mental issues and things like that. And so in this story, just in her confessions and the things that she talked about, I think that eventually they were getting, moving ahead, but they were kind of getting to getting along and things like that. But isolation is just one of those things that if you can't find your place, it's just very difficult to find yourself as a human being.
One example I found in the book was when she and the other women were doing their hair, and she said, I think they forget that I'm white, which is, I love that part. She felt isolated at that moment, even though she was present and involved, and she spoke like everyone else. Because of her past experiences, she began to withdraw within herself and see that she recognized the difference, but she wanted that difference to be actual physical difference. It's very disheartening for people to feel isolated from people they really love, or people or things that they feel like they should enjoy, like braiding hair. I really like that, braiding hair. A lot of people braid hair. I was like, oh gosh. But that part really stuck out to me, that she felt really isolated in that part. But at the same time, she was culturally involved. So for me, I think there's a huge connection between color and culture. She felt different color-wise, but she felt the same cultural-wise. So find different cultures, get involved, yay.
I don't really have a lot to add on to that. The way I saw it, though, it kind of was reminiscent of, to me, for some reason, like watching videos in grade school of like schools being integrated, and how the not the students necessarily, but their parents and their communities were like experienced some kind of cultural shock, where they like couldn't handle that something new was happening, it was changing, and they weren't part of it, and they weren't responsible for it. And so I think you see that a lot in the story, where people are kind of upset that they didn't have like any control over the decision, and they didn't have like input or anything to do with the idea that parts of their culture were changing. And it just seemed like a really bad thing, like impure motive kind of floating around with that part of the story. That wasn't necessarily the protagonist's like focus, but it was happening on the sidelines a lot.
And I do, just there's one thing that she says in there, in that she says that I am a chameleon. I move in and out of all of my cells. And I think that's key. And it's kind of what we talked about earlier, Tammy, just that you, within different settings, you are a different person. And I think that complexity occurs even more so when you are a person of color, just because you have to learn to move in and out of circles and really be a chameleon within those circles. And it can be, I think, a little bit isolating. And then I also wanted to talk about with her grandkids, she talked about how they don't ever talk about the fact that they are white, and that they always identify with being black. And I think that adding the element of being biracial also creates some form of isolation in terms of having to deny one side of yourself in order to move forward in this world. So I think that's important.
And just kind of keeping with that motif, we can't forget, I know it's the Confessions of Lois Carter, but you know, her husband is Junior. So it's Roscoe, sorry, her husband is Roscoe. And so imagine what Roscoe had to give up too, because they're both giving up something to get each other, and they're both having to be those chameleons and kind of code switch. And I feel like in her level, she's a lot more isolated because she doesn't really have a great relationship with her mother-in-law, and whereas he still has his mother. And then, you know, the component of just, they have kids, and she's like, she automatically in the book assigns them the fact that they're white, as opposed to saying they're biracial. Or the kids took on the fact that, oh, they're black. They identify more as that, and that component of biracial never came in there. So I think that Lois has this kind of idea that, like, okay, I married the man that I love, but what did I give up for it? You know, did you give up a piece of your cultural identity for it? And that's the question that a lot of people, I think, in interracial relationships kind of have to answer. Unfortunately, society, I think, is the one that puts that constraint on there that, you know, I don't feel like you should have to give up your sense of cultural identity to be with the person that you love.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we picked up on when I was talking about it in my class, like oddly throughout this whole collection, like the married relationship of Roscoe and Lois is by far like the healthiest relationship of anybody's in the book, and I think part of that might come from that they both, in a sense, are isolated from their own communities in different ways, and they have that one bond to kind of go back to. I've been given the 5-minute warning, so. We're gonna skip the story respite real quick because I think we kind of touched on that with the character of Pearline and as John mentioned, the kind of culture shock that she experiences. But the last story for me, before I met my father, again focused on the isolation of the narrator, Angie, as she kind of searched for her father. But I think one of the things that jumped out at me in this story was the way in which Wilkinson was able to kind of contrast life in small rural towns versus a large city like Cincinnati. I think she has a phrase where in the small town, Angie says, you know, the 6 black families on that hillside are like raisins on a hill. And then she goes to Cincinnati and she says something like, you know, there are forests of black men here. You know, and so just that contrast of being one of few or being one of many. And so I guess my final question would really be, what are the benefits and drawbacks to trying to have these discussions or understanding other cultures in small towns versus big cities?
Well, I don't know. I think sometimes that larger cities tend to think that they've got it all figured out, and they may be less likely to have the conversation. I don't know, in your smaller cities, I do feel like that you actually have more, I don't know, I think you would have more interaction with each other because you do go to school together. And there may be chances in the larger cities for there to be more isolation, even though there may be more diversity. There may be less intermingling within the communities. So I think that in a smaller setting, you do have more opportunity to cross lines and actually have conversations, and that's my opinion.
I definitely like your comment about, though the city is bigger, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have it all figured out. Bigger is not always better because you are more diverse, but you're also more secluded too, because you can kind of just stay in your own little neighborhood, stay in your own little enclave, and you never really have to branch out. So I do feel like, though, on the flip side of that, being in a rural town, if it's all one race and you're the only one that's not, then you tend to really stick out. I mean, you really, really stick out. And so it kind of, I guess it would kind of depend on your preference because, in the larger city, you do have that deeper sense of community, that deeper sense of belonging because there's more people to associate with. But in a smaller town, it's not necessarily there. It's, you know everybody, but it's not always the same.
So the way you're saying it's the same everywhere. Basically wherever you're from, it's those same things are going on, the same things happen. And just one comment that I'm sorry, that really gets me, you were talking about how they define the children as interracial children. I guess that really bothers me because it really should just be the children. Because unfortunately people continue to breed the hate. They continue to breed, the differences between us versus trying to bring us all together. And I guess the children, in essence, from when it began until who knows how long it continues, will be the ones that suffer because they don't know. They're taught to recognize all these differences, and they're taught to make us think that we're different when we're really not supposed to be thought of that way. And I guess it's hard for me to think that the children shouldn't be defined because then they grow up with those definitions. And if they're not defined as interracial or whatever, then they can grow up to be more better thinking people.
I definitely agree. One of my favorite people of all time is comedian activist Dick Gregory. He said, I wasn't born knowing how to hate. I had to go to school for that. So if you kind of think about it, yeah, it should just be the children. It shouldn't be black, white, pink, orange, whatever color you are. It should be just the children. But that should make it all the more conscious for us to know that what we are saying, what we are doing, the way that we're portraying ourselves is a very big influence on the kids because they're going to put out what we give them. And so I think there's that component too, but I also feel that, you should have pride in your cultural identity. I think that, especially for biracial children, I think you can merge the two and still be proud of both sides, both cultures, both heritages. It's just a matter of, can that child be taught well enough and be strong enough to be able to handle it and not be pulled in by all of the other distracting stuff?
One example I would give is, so my teacher who is white has a son who's also white, but he was in a hospital and the doctor was black. And so out of curiosity, the boy asked us like, Mom, why is my doctor darker than every other person in this room? And everyone laughed. In contrast to the other story where my other teacher had a child and the child asked and was like, why is my doctor darker than everyone else? And the mom was like, shh, don't talk about that, shh, that's rude. And so 2 of those children are going to grow up differently. One is going to grow up and recognize that we're different, but we're still human beings. And one is going to grow up and say, oh, we're different, but I'm better. Because we cannot talk about these other people because that's a sacred territory. We can't go in there. Just breaking those barriers as we are all growing up, we realize that we are all humans first before we're black or white or purple, diabetic, I don't know, anything you can think of. But that's one thing I really want to say.
Oh, right here. Okay, so what the key takeaway then for this conversation, it comes from Pearline's chapter. I've got a few students in here. They're probably going to know what quote I'm about to give. One of my favorite lines from Lois's chapter was when she looks down at her and Roscoe's hands and she says, I looked down at his hands just a few shades darker than mine and realized they're just hands. So wouldn't that then be the key takeaway that we are different, we need to recognize them, but they're just hands, we're still people, right? That coming together and having those conversations, the key takeaway then would be that it doesn't really I don't want to say it doesn't matter what race we are, because I think it does matter. Just like I think it's not okay to say, oh, I don't see race. It's like, that's saying you can't see blonde hair, right? Like, but boiling down to, we are just people, right? And we need to respect those differences, cultural, physical, whatever, right? Wouldn't that then be the key takeaway?
And I think, yes, and I think that it's also very important for us to just recognize that we are people, and I value relationships just like I would think that most of the people in this room value relationships. So it's very important for us to develop relationships with each other so that we can learn to respect each other and ask those questions that will make us better people.
I'd like to thank our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you all again for being here. I have a couple of quick things. First, we're going to give away our book, but also I wanted to invite you, make sure to draw your attention to the screen and the big event for Water Street, which is next semester. It's in March, but all of our information about any events like this, we do have more planned. We have book discussions planned. We actually have another panel discussion scheduled for January 30th that's going to shift focus to mental health issues and some of those issues that come in some of the different stories in Water Street. So we invite you to come to that. But our website, onebookread.com, lists all of our events and everything that we have planned with the times and locations. So we hope you can participate as much as possible in this discussion continuing to the arrival of Crystal Wilkinson on campus, which we're so excited about in March. That's the 12th and 13th. And free events, again, we just invite everyone to come. And also, I'm proud to introduce Shaveen Duncan-Herring, who is the director of our Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and she wanted to say a few words today.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you all for being here. But most of all, when we think about it, is 2018, and we are just having this conversation. It is time, and I would like to say that to have this one book read of Water Street, if that is what it has taken to promote this conversation here at West Kentucky Community and Technical College, as well as the community of Paducah, then let's open the door and let's continue to have this conversation as we continue to promote the cultural education that we need for our students to become productive citizens throughout not only Paducah but through the nation. And I would like to say thank you to the One Book Read Committee for having the foresight to bring a book here to be the One Book Read for this year. Not only is it a book to promote the conversation, but it also highlights an African American author that is from Kentucky. So I say to you, if you have not read the book, I promote you to read the book, encourage others to read the book. Let's continue to have this conversation, and let's continue to be more culturally aware of what's going on around us, and let's just look at each other as one. Thank you.
Shaveen's drawing our name, and our winner is Allison McGoyan. She's still here? You have to be present to win. Sorry, Allison. Oh, gosh. Sorry, I cannot. Austin, maybe? Bert? No, I'm sorry. Christine. Okay, the phone number. No, do you want me to read the phone number? Christina? No. Okay, I'm going to have to say the phone number, 270-625-8206. I'm sorry, I can't read handwriting. You're the winner of our book.
It's become a habit to
Okay, let me get your book for you. I want to encourage everyone, if there are refreshments left, I think there are, please feel free to partake, and thank you again to our panelists. Please continue to promote the One Book Read. Thank you so much for coming.